So it's time to begin. So we're going to be going into the time from Abraham to Joseph. Full archaeological this time, no genetics, nothing like that. So we're starting with Abraham. And just for getting everyone settled to this time period, here are a few key events in Abraham's life, as well as potential timelines for those. These are likely to be off by maybe a few years either way, but just to get you in the ballpark. Now, Abraham was a nomad for 4,000 years ago, give or take. So we're unlikely to find any physical evidence from him specifically. That he didn't really build a lot of stone monuments or anything like that that we could find that he left behind. The main focus in this section of scripture is to verify the account by the details given to make sure they are historically accurate for the time. I also want you to keep in mind everything that we've covered previously. This is about 450 years after the flood. So this would be about the peak time in the Ice Age, where the ocean levels would have been at their lowest, and the environment would have been still very lush, but starting to dry out. And as it dries out, that would make sense with what we see in Scripture with the famines popping up every so often. Now the first thing of note is the Battle of Sedum, that means the Salt Sea. And you have a number of kings, the kings on the left versus the kings on the right. And this is what we'd expect to find at this time. Not only are the names of the kings very similar to what are on documents from this time period, but the turmoil would also match what is expected. And some of you may ask, what is in a name? Why does it matter if their names are on documents at the same time? Well, names do give us some idea of the time period. For example, you probably don't know anybody named Elmo, Grover, or Kermit. A few generations ago, those names have been relatively common, but thanks to Jim Henson, not so much today. And so, based upon some of these details, we can know that these events occurred at the time period where they say they occurred. Some do say that Abraham couldn't have had camels because camels weren't domesticated until the 9th century. This is not the case. We see, this is Dr. Titus Kennedy, Egyptologist, archaeologist, bones, hairs, wall paintings, models, inscriptions, seals, documents, statues, and stelae from numerous archaeological sites all suggest the camel was in use as a domestic animal in the ancient Near East as early as the 3rd millennium BC. This means just after the flood, a few centuries after the flood, camels were in use. You can see a statue of one as well as a petroglyph of a man with a camel. And so, again, Abraham has the animals we'd expect him to have. We also see similar people traveling to Egypt, the same that Abraham did. Excuse me. This is a depiction of Asiatics, meaning people from the Levant, or basically what we would think of as the Middle East today, in Beni Hassan. These are people coming into Egypt. The person in this tomb spent their life basically as a border checkpoint. And so when people come in, he would take care of all that. And so they wrote down all of his achievements on his tomb. And we see these group of Asiatics. We know they're Asiatics because you see the ones on the left versus the ones on the far right, they're dressed completely different. Different skin tones, different hairstyles, different clothing. So this is likely to be the similar clothing that Abraham, as well as Isaac and Jacob's children, would have been wearing. If you think of Joseph's many-colored tunic, his coat, it might have been something similar to some of these patterns here. We also see them wearing or using equipment, tools. The one on the far left is carrying something called a duckbill axe. Remember that will come into effect later. Now, I want to make sure these are not the Israelites. These are just people that lived in the area that the Israelites lived in. So they probably would have had some similar culture as far as clothing, equipment, and stuff like that. Another thing to mention about this time is that Hittites are mentioned in the Bible from Genesis 10 to Genesis 23. For a long time, it was thought that the Hittites were a mythological people because their only mention is in the Bible. And frequently you will see this, where people will say the Bible is inaccurate because we have no evidence to support it in certain areas. This is an argument for silence, or from silence. It's not a good argument, and As you can see, or as you will see in the next slide, it's going to be proven wrong. This is the Hittite capital. It is 300 acres. It was excavated in 1906. It has a fortified citadel, 5 temples, several massive sculptures and carvings, underground defenses, as well as many clay tablets depicting their treaties with other nations. Hittites were in fact a huge empire similar to Egypt at the time, and they were actually fighting against Egypt in the Canaan area. They would go either north or south, depending on which empire you're talking about, and they would fight in there and fight over these territories. And these are some of the massive sculptures that they had, as well as you can see the city in the top right. So an argument from silence is a very poor argument against the Bible. You will see that whenever the Bible says something and we have information about that subject, it agrees with the Bible. And this is an interesting place. This is called the Tomb of the Patriarchs in Hebron. So this is supposedly where Abraham, Sarah, and all the patriarchs were buried. Now this building here obviously was not built by Abraham or any of them. This was built by Herod later on. Now the problem with this is that we cannot see what's inside. Abraham is involved with 3 major religious groups: Christianity, Judaism, and Islam. And as such, doing anything with something that is supposedly belonging to him or related to him is extremely difficult politically. Perhaps one day we can get in there, but for now it is a big question mark, but a potential. But nearby, we are told that there are oaks of Mamre. So in Genesis 13:18, we see, so Abraham moved his tent and came and settled by the oaks of Mamre, which are in Hebron. And there he built an altar to the Lord. It's also nearby where he purchased the cave. In this excavation in 1920, they dug down to the bedrock and found massive trees that would be consistent with the oaks of Mamre. They were actually in the bedrock. They also found a little spring, so again, consistent with what the Bible tells us. And in this area, we find that it has a strong history of being related to Abraham. In the 600s AD, we have the Islamic period where they went around the site and they believe that this was a site for Abraham. You can see the color coding on the far right with the depictions on the map with the same color coding. And then before them, the Byzantine area. The Byzantines came into the Holy Land, the Canaan area, and they built a number of churches. They usually built them on sites that had decent history, so a good history that connected to biblical events. This is the only place that relates to an Old Testament event where they built a church. In Herod's time, he of course built that massive structure I showed previously. And then in the Patriarchal Period, we see that people were living here based upon the pottery. Now, again, Abraham was not the main settler in this area. We know that there were some Hittites here, but we know that people lived here just like the Bible said, and you can see a long list of historical connections to Abraham from all these people living in these areas. Now, for Isaac and Jacob, we're not really going to have much differences as far as Abraham. Everything that we said about Abraham is still the same for Isaac and Jacob. They didn't really do anything incredibly different from Abraham. They lived in the same area. They lived in about the same time period. They did some of the same things and lived the same kind of life. And so we wouldn't expect to find anything from them directly. And again, all the details that the Bible gives are consistent the same way that Abraham's details were consistent. But here is a general timeline for some of the events in their lives. Now, the next thing we're going to be talking about is Joseph, because this is where we start to get into a lot more detail. Unfortunately, we still have a number of questions. If you are unfamiliar with the Egyptian timeline, this is the generally, not accepted, but what is held to today. Today, a number of people, in fact, the majority of archaeologists, Egyptologists, seem to want to alter the Egyptian timeline. The problem is that they can't agree on what to change it to, so no one's changing it yet. But the current one that is promoted is this. You have a early dynastic period and a pre-dynastic period that people live in this area for a few centuries to 1,000 years or more. You then have the Old Kingdom period, where people are basically connecting all of Egypt. They're living united. They're starting to look like a monarchy of some sort, a kingdom. And there's a number of dynasties, another number of ruling families in this period, eventually getting to the first intermediate period. During this time, Egypt basically breaks up. They're not united anymore. Middle Kingdom, again, connect again. They start building some more monuments, stuff like that. Second Intermediate Period, you have a bunch of warring factions. New Kingdom Period, this is the one that we know the most about, and if you know any pharaoh name, it is probably from this period, like King Tut and stuff like that. This is the period that we know the most about archaeologically. We then have the Third Intermediate Period, and from that point on, Egypt never really reaches its heyday. You have some power underneath Rome and stuff like that when it's ruled by Greece and Rome, but the Egyptians themselves never really gain power or really that big on the world stage anymore. Now, how do we know all this? Well, a lot is taken from this guy named Manetho. He was an Egyptian priest that Ptolemy II, and that's Ptolemy II there on the right, not Manetho. He was to compile a history of Egypt. And it doesn't really seem that it's supposed to be a chronological account. It also has a number of inconsistencies with other contemporary sources. So we have found archaeologically a number of kings lists, the Turin and the Abydos kings list. And Manetho's kings list doesn't really overlap much with those. You may find one or two names, but the vast majority, no match at all. You have this quote here, a late, careless, and uncritical compilation which can be proven wrong from the contemporary monuments in the vast majority of cases where such documents have survived. And we don't even have Manetho's original works. A lot of what we have from Manetho is quoted by other people. Josephus is one that quotes him. And so it's all secondhand sources. So we don't even know exactly what he said. We just have quotes from people arguing against him. Another way that they get their timeline is something called the Sothic cycle. The Sothis star is the dog star or Sirius today. It rises annually. It's not visible all year round in Egypt. And so they're proposing timing the rising of this star with the Egyptian calendar to get a date, because when you have an astronomical event, you can then use math to get an exact date and connect that calendar to our calendar. There are some problems with this. For one, we're assuming that they have the same starting point of a calendar. The Israelites, for example, have two calendars with two different starting points. And so there are some contradictory information as far as what the starting point was. You also have to assume that the Egyptians used the same calendar for their entire history. There are some problems with this. Today, and for the last millennia or two almost, we have used the same calendar. That's not been the same for all of history. And that's why October, November, and December are not our 8th, 9th, or 10th month. Thank you, Julius Caesar and Augustus Caesar. July and August, they decided to put their names in there. I don't know why they put them at the end or something like that, but no, they put them right in the middle to mess up the numbering system. So changes like that do occur. We also have to have a document that has the rising of the Sothis star, the dog star, with a date of the Egyptian calendar. These are rare. We also need to know where the observer was, because if they were at the upper or lower Egypt, they would have a different rising point. And so, furthermore, when we do have some documents that fit all of these, it gives us contradictory information. So based upon the document, we'd expect certain things to be occurring, but they're not, or vice versa. One document says the Nile is flooding when it should not have been flooding. And so there's a lot of problems with this, and there's very little historical support. So overall, how confident can we be with Egyptian chronology? Many will then try to use the archaeological finds that we have. There are a few problems with that as well. Egyptians were master propagandists. They never lost a battle, and when they won, they completely destroyed their enemies. Because in their mind, if they did great things, they would be remembered. And if they were remembered, they would live on in the afterlife. And you want your pharaoh to live on in the afterlife, because if he lived on in the afterlife, you would live on in the afterlife. He'd put a good word in for you. And so all this is why we have a number of these things written down as far as them doing massive, massive things. So we have to take everything with a little grain of salt. That being said, we can get some accurate information. For example, if they continue to win battles closer and closer to home, they're probably not winning battles. And so we can get some good information from this. We also have a number of other contemporary histories, and this includes the Bible. So these are histories from other civilizations in the area. The Assyrians and Babylonians were very good about doing good history. Every year would be named for a big event of that time period, of that year. And we can get that connected to our day based upon solar eclipses. This is actually how we connect the biblical calendar to our calendar. Overall, we can be semi-confident back to about 1500 BC as far as chronology goes, Egyptian or otherwise. We have a lot of good interconnections with all these histories that we can be relatively confident within a few decades. But that still leaves a number of centuries, if not millennia, that Egypt has extra time. How do we connect that to the Bible? Because the Bible only goes back to about 2300 as far as the flood. Egyptians would not have been there during the flood. We can do this if we put it in the correct place. You will see a number of people trying to correct Egyptian history by altering the New Kingdom and beyond. So basically everything from the New Kingdom forward, the Greco-Roman and stuff like that. We have a lot of information and a lot of interconnections, so it's very, very difficult for that to really jump anything more than a few years to a decade or two. And so if you do that, you fix one problem, but you make a number of other problems even with the biblical text itself. The biblical events match very good with what we know about Egyptian history at that time. But pre-dynastic and early dynastic periods, we have very little evidence, some pottery, but no graves. If they existed there for thousands of years or even centuries, there should be numerous graves. The Middle Kingdom and the Old Kingdom, we do have some information because they did build things, they did build monuments, but we don't have anywhere near as amount of information as the New Kingdom period. And the first and second intermediate periods are dark periods. We know very little with that. So here are a number of pharaohs that are mentioned in the Bible by name that we can connect to known Egyptian rulers. We can also connect certain biblical events to what are called scarabs. This is a beetle on one side that has a cartouche, or basically the name of a pharaoh, on the other. Some of these were patterns as well, but usually it was a name. When we find these in certain archaeological sediments, so basically in a destruction layer or right underneath the building, we have an idea that that building occurred after that pharaoh ruled. And so we can then make a number of interconnections and get a decent timeline from that. Again, we can be relatively confident from 1500 onward that we are relatively close to exact dates. Some will then try to move it like this. So this is a bit more accurate. Now, I'm not saying this is the exact correct way of changing Egyptian history, but this is one way that we could do that. Everything from 15 beyond has been smushed down a little bit. And so there are a number of different ways you can put this. I'm not arguing for this one, I'm just trying to show you that we can do that. But before we can figure out what happens with Egyptian history, we need to make sure we're aware of the biblical chronology itself, the events of the Bible. So again, with the Assyrian calendar, with its solar eclipses and such, we can connect it to the biblical calendar based upon overlapping events. For one, the destruction of Jerusalem. We have documents of them attacking Jerusalem. We also have documents of them interacting with a number of kings. We're going to use the destruction of Jerusalem simply because it gives us the widest timeline. But we can be very confident that the Solomon's temple, as well as his reign, being about 976 BC, give or take a year or two. We can then go from Solomon's reign to the Exodus, about 1447 BC, again, give or take a year or two, back to Abraham, 1877, and then from Abraham, we can then work our way to Joseph in Egypt. There is one potential problem with this, though. There are two ideas as far as how long the Israelites were sojourning. There is the long sojourn view and the short sojourn view. The long sojourn view basically has the timer start when Israel was in Egypt. The short sojourn view has the timer start when Abraham received his promise. And so we need to make sure we know exactly what the Bible is telling us before we can then try to use it to figure out what's going on in the rest of the world and to look for what the Bible says we should find. If we're looking for Joseph in the wrong time period, we're not going to get a good answer. These are a number of biblical passages that talk about the length of the sojourn of Israel. We know from Genesis 15 that they would be enslaved and oppressed for 400 years and return in the fourth generation in a land that is not theirs. Exodus 12:40, 430 years to the day that they came out. Acts 7, 400 years. Acts 13, about 450 years with the wanderings of Moses in the desert. Galatians 3, the law came 430 years after the promise, talking about the law on Mount Sinai. And we have a number of genealogies and chronologies. And A chronology is a genealogy with years. You'll see this in Genesis 5 and 11. Those are a more detailed chronology than what we have, but the chronology I'm speaking of is Moses's, where it gives the full length of their years, not exactly when they gave birth to their child. The main crux is Exodus 12:40. And that's because this passage can be translated one of two ways. One, it can be translated, now the time that the sons of Israel lived in Egypt was 430 years, denoting the entire length of the sojourn was in Egypt. Or, now the sojourn of the children of Israel who lived in Egypt was 430 years, denoting the final location of Israel during the sojourn. Both of these are grammatically correct. And if you look in your Bible today, you may have one or the other translation. If you try to hold to the long sojourn view, many that argue for this will frequently go into textual variants, the Septuagint and stuff like that. You don't really need to do that. Because if you hold to that view, you have to have a lot of corrections, a lot of problems that you got with these other verses. For one, I have not found anyone who can explain return in the fourth generation, as far as the long sojourn view. The question is then, where does the 400 years start? They'll give a starting point for 430, but where does the 400 start? And then with the chronologies and genealogies, they will say that there are gaps in there. We have to be very, very careful before we say that there are gaps in what the Bible tells us. That is the same argument that gets us to billions and billions of years in the Adam genealogies. Now there is one in Matthew that does have some gaps. We know that because the Bible gives us the full genealogies in the Old Testament. What Matthew is trying to do is trying to get the number 14, trying to get you to memorize that because 14 was the number of David. He's basically just saying, David, 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 Jesus is the son of David. So he's using that as a teaching tool, it seems. But we have to be very careful to take these, especially since all these genealogies agree with each other, which means you have to take them out of all of them, which is not something you really want to do unless you have a lot of evidence. But for the short sojourn view, it all makes perfect sense. Even the fourth generation, from Isaac, who had been born at this time, Jacob, Levi, Jochebed, Moses' mother, and Moses. 4 generations that they came out of Egypt. It also makes perfect sense with the chronologies and genealogies. It's a much, much better fit, biblically speaking. So overall, Israel would have been in Egypt about 215 years. So 215 years wanderings in Canaan, 215 years in Egypt. Excuse me. That would place Joseph in the second intermediate period if we have the correct Egyptian chronology right now. The main ruler in Egypt at this time would have been called the Hyksos. They were the foreign kings. And so you can see there, about just after the Middle Kingdom, the second intermediate period with a little circle there. Now there are some other thoughts that I want to mention here real quick before we go further. For one, some will hold to a later date of the Exodus, meaning that Joseph would have been about 200 years after the second intermediate period. The problem with this is that they mainly have the evidence of the mention of Ramses there. I just want to mention this real quickly. We'll probably mention this again next time. But Ramses was a city that the Israelites built. This is an example of a textual update. You will find frequently that names of places have been updated to a more recent name. The key of this, the most notable, is the city Dan. City Dan was, of course, named after the tribe of Dan. This is mentioned at the time of Abraham. Definitely would have been Dan at this time. In fact, we know archaeologically what its name was. Unfortunately, the name escapes me at this point. But that's an example of a textual update. This is another example of the textual update. At Moses' time, the city of Ramses would have been called Peru-Nefer. At the time of Joseph, it would likely be called Avaris, and we'll get into that in a little bit. Another thought is that Joseph existed during the Middle Kingdom in the 12th dynasty, and there are two ways of reaching this. One, you can hold to current Egyptian chronology and the long sojourn view, or the short sojourn view and alter Egyptian chronology, and there are plenty of evidence to suggest that as well. But as far as the evidence for Joseph in the 12th dynasty, it is very limited. You will find a number of people out there trying to promote this view, and many good archaeologists as well. And that is because, well, they will promote this because there are a number of Semitic people coming into Egypt at this time. And Avaris is one known place to house Israel, and it was growing at this time with Semitic peoples from the Levant, people from Canaan. And so they tried to connect people from the 12th dynasty with known biblical figures. The main four that are pushed forward are Joseph, Jacob, Ephraim, Manasseh, and then somewhat Manasseh's son Shechem. You can see here a depiction of Shechem, was actually given his name, little child it looks like, leading a donkey with a guy named Hebeded on it. Excuse me. And there are connections with these people to people living in Avaris. Now, Egyptian titles were something that was given to you based upon something you've done, or something that defined you. Hebeded, for example, means the disfavored. And so people will try to connect the disfavored to Manasseh, because when Jacob blessed Manasseh and Ephraim, he switched his hands and gave the older one the younger one blessing, and switched them around. And so they'll argue that this means that this is Manasseh, because he has a son named Shechem, and Manasseh had a son named, we do not know that this is his son. We just know that this is a child named Shechem. So they try to connect that to being his son, and since Manasseh had a son named Shechem, that this must be Manasseh. Unfortunately, there are very few strong connections. Titles can mean a number of things. We don't know that he was disfavored for anything particularly. Or another title that they try to connect to Jacob, Horus is in his son, or the Levantine. There are many people from the Levant living at this time, and it's kind of weird that you have a person that's following God have the title Horus is in his son. I don't know if they really accept that. And so I just want to make sure that you have some awareness of this, so that if you come across this, you can see that there are very tenuous connections, and we need to make sure before we connect something to what the Bible says, lest when we are proven wrong, that we bring shame upon the Bible and discredit the Bible, even though we're the one that was discredited. A few other things of note is that there is a production of the alphabet about this time in Egypt, starting from about the 1800s to about the 1400s. We see this starting to pop up. And this is the same alphabet that was later used by the Israelites and the people in the Levant. We'll get more into this later. We also have something called the Bar Yusuf. This is called the waterway of Joseph. So on the pictures there, you can see the Nile, that little green strip in the desert, and a little bitty branch that looks like it's a branching leaf on a vine. That is called the Fayum, and that little branch is the Bar Yusuf. The Fayum is called the bread basket of Egypt. And so this is where they can produce a lot of their crops. And while it is called the Bar Yusuf, and it was built in the 12th dynasty, I could not find, and I have not found anybody saying that it was called the Bar Yusuf in the 12th dynasty. Things changed their name. For example, the city of David. It was ruled by the Jebusites. Well, as soon as he moved in, that was then called the city of David. And so different names can occur, as well as building projects can rebuild certain things. And so it could be that this connects to Joseph of the Bible at a later date. It could be that Joseph was here and built it in the 12th dynasty. Or it could be that someone else named Joseph built this and it's just a coincidence. We have nothing to concretely connect this to Joseph the Bible or this time period, unfortunately. But let's look at the second intermediate period. So how do we get to that? Well, we have that powerful 12th dynasty that I was just mentioning, ruling all of Egypt. Then there was some inheritance issues, and that led to the 13th dynasty. And they basically just shrunk because of poor management. They didn't do a good job. Evidently, the 12th dynasty had such good bureaucratic systems that it continued for a while, but eventually it shrunk. There was a 14th dynasty that quickly popped up in the Nile Delta, that then soon plummeted. And the 13th dynasty retreated south and became the 16th dynasty with potentially a few other ruling cities. And then the 15th dynasty came in. And this is the one that we're going to be focusing on, the 15th dynasty. You can see the picture on the right, them moving in. These were the Hyksos, the foreign rulers. They came in from Canaan, and you can see there one of their cartouches, one of the things that was on their scarabs, as well as a statue of a person from the Levant. And they ruled over most of Egypt until they were replaced by the 17th dynasty and a pharaoh named Ahmose I, who established the 18th dynasty and the New Kingdom period. And the Hyksos seem to take power about the same time as Joseph entering Egypt. The Hyksos, we don't know how many kings they had. Unfortunately, we don't know a lot about them. They either had 5 to 31 kings. Some of these, though, we do know relatively a decent amount. Pepi is one who seems to have ruled from 1600 to 1560. He is also named Apophis. And if you know anything about Egyptian mythology, that's not a good name. The Egyptians really didn't like him. They didn't like any of the foreign rulers for that matter. And then Kamudi, again, another one we know. You can see the scarab of one of them on the right. Now, Manetho, remember the Egyptian priest, he basically said that they came in and conquered Egypt without striking a blow. Now, he gives, as far as war details and stuff like that, basically just came in and conquered everything. There are a number of problems with this. They are depicted in Egyptian history, Egyptian propaganda, as foreign attackers, invaders, and they just came in and wiped them out. But we're not seeing that archaeologically. And this is shown with tooth enamel of all things. So they can take these Hyksos, these Levantines that are living there in Avaris. There's a graveyard. They can find their teeth. And based upon their enamel, they can show if this person grew up in this area or not. And what they found was that all the men, or at least the majority of men, all grew up in Egypt, in this area. But the women did not. The women came from other places. And they don't know where the women came from. You can't tell that from the enamel. But you know that they came in from their places. So you have a large number of males bringing women, their wives, in from other areas. We see this in the Bible with Abraham and Isaac's wife. And so it seems to be that these people were living there and sending off for their wives. So they came in peaceably. We'd expect the other way around if they came in attacking warfare. Because the men come in, they kill all the other men, and they take their wives for their wives. So what we're seeing is that they came in seemingly peacefully. And this makes sense with what we know of the rest of history, as far as Egyptian history. In the 12th dynasty and the 13th dynasty, we have a lot of people coming in for the Levant. They then seem to be gaining power, and as the Egyptians themselves lose power because they're not running things well, the Levantines then set up their own kingdom. But a lot of the things that we have from them are destroyed. When they were either chased out or left, a lot of things that they have were destroyed. Egyptians, remember, if you were remembered, then you had an afterlife. So if you were not remembered, then you had no afterlife. And so this is an ultimate parting gift from the Egyptian. They're not only trying to kill them, they don't want them to not even have an afterlife. But again, it's because of the shifting demographics that they seem to have come in and grown rich. Their capital was the city of Avaris. This is in the Nile Delta. And we'll get a little bit more into the city itself. But does this time period match with what we see in the Bible? The most notable piece of evidence are the chariots. So archaeologically, it seems that chariots came into Egypt because of the Hyksos. We have chariots existing in Mesopotamia and, as a result, the Levant. But then, in Egyptian history, we have no evidence of chariots prior to the Second Intermediate Period. In fact, we have some evidence to suggest that they didn't even get chariots themselves by building them. They stole them from the Hyksos. So basically, they came in, they raided, they stole their chariots, and then they used them against them in battle. And so everything that we have archaeologically is pointing to the chariot coming in because of the Hyksos and not from before. In Genesis, though, we see Joseph riding in a chariot many times. And so this seems to be that chariots were ubiquitous. They were everywhere. They were in common use. So this is a strong point that Joseph did not exist in Egypt prior to this. We also have Joseph's position. While there were some Asiatic, some Levantine people gaining certain periods or positions of power at this time, it's just very unusual for such a person, such a foreigner, to be raised to such a high position so quickly. Now the Hyksos, remember, they were from Canaan. They were from the same culture as Joseph. They were from the same area as Joseph. And so it is far more likely that they would raise Joseph to such a high position so quickly compared to the Egyptians who, as you can see after the Hyksos left, that they didn't really like any foreigners. They were kind of racist in that matter, as many cultures are. We also have similar customs. So the Hyksos maintained their own funerary customs involving burying the dead close to home. And we can see that the ruler of Egypt at this time, Pharaoh, if he was a Hyksos, he seems to be very accepting of this, which we'd expect that to be the case. If he was an Egyptian, it's surprising that he was so accepting of this. Now, some will say that because the Hyksos didn't rule all of Egypt, they can't possibly be the Pharaoh of Joseph, since he had basically people paying him from all over Egypt. Yet, we do have evidence of them getting tribute from all over Egypt. So while they did not have absolute authority, they did not rule over them themselves, they were a client kingdom. They were a kingdom that paid them tribute. They were literally underneath them. And that would make sense with what we see in the Bible. That is, until the 17th dynasty rebelled, they then attacked, stole some chariots and stuff like that, and eventually, we'll find out later what happens to the Hyksos. But some other minor links, the names, we see Jacob, Joseph, in other Egyptian writings. In fact, one of the Hyksos pharaohs, or at least a scarab from the Hyksos, is named Jacob. We have a Jacob scarab. Now, this is most likely not the Jacob of the Bible, but still, we have the people of this time period having the same names. Remember, we already talked about how names can be very good about getting a good time period. We also have people in Egypt receiving Egyptian names. The Papyrus Brooklyn 35, 1446 has a list of household slaves with their both Semitic name as well as their Egyptian name. Even the slave price is for this time period, which is just extremely interesting. Before this, about 2100 BC, slaves were 8 to 10 shekels, then 20, then 30, and then eventually 120, about 400 BC. But you see that the price for Joseph is the price that we'd expect a slave to go for about this time. Dream interpretation, as well as a common hobby of the Egyptians at this time, and we already talked about Bar Yusuf, the waterway of Joseph. So it does fit chronologically with this time very well. Unfortunately, we probably will not find any strong evidence to say that this was Joseph, these were the Israelites here. And that's because, again, Israel and the Hyksos had a very similar culture as far as their clothing, as far as their tools, as far as how they lived. Now, the city of Avaris, this is the Hyksos capital. Today it is called Tel El Daba, Peru Nephar about Moses' time, Avaris about this time, and then Ramses later on. This is located inside the land of Goshen. The land of Goshen is a very large area in the Nile Delta. It did exist prior to the Hyksos, and it was also the Hyksos' last stand. It was their capital. This is a lush area due to the Nile. Unfortunately, though, it also has a lot of water because of that, and water does not allow for things to survive very long. That being said, we do have a number of houses, some cemeteries, tombs, and thankfully trash. Trash is the archaeologist's best friend. Now, some of the things that we have found here, we find many signs of Asiatic Semites, people of the Levant. We see their axes. You can see the duck-built axe in the top right. And you can see, again, a close-up view of the man carrying that. These were only made in the Levant. You can see there pictures where they were found. And so this is not a common Egyptian tool. Yet we find these buried in the city. We also see them buried with their own livestock, horses, donkeys, sheep, stuff like that. We see a large palace built during the Hyksos period. But again, it's going to be very hard to say which of these were Hyksos and which of these were Israel and of his household. It's literally, well, not literally, but it's like finding a needle in a haystack. It's going to be very, very hard to differentiate these two people. Now, the Hyksos eventually were kicked out. Manetho and other Egyptian sources basically say that they were fought off. So the Hyksos people have long been portrayed as an invading force from the Near East, but but evidence to substantiate this claim have been difficult. Following their fall from power, the Egyptians all but erased the Hyksos from their history. So we really don't have anything else to go on. All we have is what the Egyptians say and a scat amount of evidence. And so we don't know if they were chased out. The Egyptians say that they surrounded them and then they left. And so we don't really know much about this. Since the Egyptians themselves were wrong about how they came in, they can't be wrong about how they left. But as far as the Exodus, we'll be going into this next time. And this is where we have a lot more information. Remember, we have a lot of information from the New Kingdom period. And this would be where the Exodus would have occurred. And so, in summary, the Bible is historically accurate. When we have information, it agrees with the Bible. The only thing that a skeptic can really argue is an argument from silence, which is a very, very poor argument. We have the Hittites, you have evidence of Abraham's life, camels, warfare, etc., the oaks of Mamre, and potentially even the tomb. Now, as far as Joseph and Egyptian history, there is a lot we don't know. Unfortunately, in this time period, the time period of the patriarchs, we don't really have a lot of archaeological finds, not only in the biblical layers, but elsewhere. It's just, there's not a lot. Not a lot have survived. But what we do have even is propaganda has a lot of problems with it as far as Manetho and the cycle. And so we cannot say for sure about a number of things. But the things we can say for sure on, such as Joseph likely being in there in the second intermediate period based upon the biblical dates. We have the chariots, we have the slave price, we have the names, we have the Hyksios, more likely to raise Joseph up to his position, all this fitting with what the Bible tells us. Now, we do have a few minutes for any questions, any comments, anything online?
I don't see anything.
Okay. One last note, I just want to make sure, it's since we have the time, some will try to connect the Hyksios to the Israelites. This is not a good fit. Not only does the time not match, but all the events of the Bible do not match. For one, they came in, but again, we don't know for sure if they fought or not. And they did fight with the Egyptians afterwards. We do have a lot of evidence to support that there was some battles going on. We don't have any record of that in the Bible. In fact, we have them being slaves, not rulers. And so we need to be very careful before we try to connect the Hyksios to the Israelites. There are some people that do, and in doing so, they keep the Egyptian chronology, and they basically say that all the plagues and stuff of the Exodus were effects from a nearby volcanic eruption, basically taking God out of the equation. So we'll go a bit more into that next time, but I just want to make a note of that now since we did talk about the Hyksios. Otherwise, I look forward to the next two classes. We're going to be talking about Moses, Egypt, and all that, and that is going to be a very exciting lesson. Thank you.